Part 0. America Before Arrival. America was not empty. Long before European ships appeared on the horizon, the land that would later be called America was already lived in, shaped, governed, and understood. It was not a blank space waiting to be discovered, nor was it an untouched wilderness existing outside of human influence. It was a continent formed through human presence over thousands of years, shaped by relationships between people, land, climate, and time. Human societies had adapted to this land across millennia. These adaptations were not accidental. They were learned, tested, refined, and passed down through generations. Every region of North America carried evidence of human decision-making, whether visible through settlement patterns, agricultural systems, hunting grounds, or trade routes. Indigenous societies across North America were extraordinarily diverse. They spoke hundreds of languages and organized themselves in ways that reflected the environments they lived in. These societies were not isolated from one another, nor were they uniform in structure or belief. They developed distinct cultures, governance systems, and social norms that made sense within their specific ecological contexts. Some communities built large permanent settlements supported by agriculture, trade, and long-standing political structures. Others lived in smaller groups that moved seasonally, following animal migrations, plant cycles, and weather patterns that required constant observation and adjustment. These differences were not indicators of advancement or simplicity. They were practical responses to geography and climate. The idea that permanence equaled progress did not universally apply. In many regions, mobility was strength. Moving with the seasons preserved resources, reduced environmental strain, and maintained balance between people and land. In other regions, stability allowed for agricultural surplus, population growth, and complex governance. Neither model was inherently superior. Each reflected a deep understanding of place. The land itself was actively managed. Forests were shaped through controlled burning that reduced undergrowth, encouraged new growth, and supported animal populations. These burns were conducted intentionally, often at specific times of year, and required detailed knowledge of wind, moisture, and vegetation. They created open forests that were easier to travel through and more productive for hunting. These practices were not destructive. They were regenerative. Fire was used as a tool rather than feared as a threat. Landscapes that Europeans later described as untouched wilderness were often the result of centuries of careful human intervention. Fields were cultivated using agricultural systems refined over generations. Crops such as maize, beans, and squash were grown together in complementary arrangements that preserved soil fertility and maximized yield. Maize provided structure, beans fixed nitrogen, and squash suppressed weeds and retained moisture. This system supported long-term productivity without exhausting the land. Agriculture was not uniform across the continent. Different regions developed different crops, planting methods, and harvesting cycles based on climate and soil. Irrigation systems were constructed in arid areas. Terracing was used where terrain demanded it. These systems reflected experimentation, adaptation, and cumulative knowledge rather than simple trial and error. Wetlands were managed rather than avoided. Rivers were understood as living systems that changed seasonally. Floodplains were used deliberately for planting. Coastlines were occupied strategically, with seasonal movement tied to fish runs and tidal cycles. The land was not something people merely lived on. It was something they lived with. This relationship with the land was not extractive. It was reciprocal. Land was understood as something that sustained life when treated with restraint and respect. Overuse carried consequences, and those consequences were learned through experience. Knowledge of these systems was cumulative, passed from one generation to the next through observation, instruction, and practice. Mistakes were remembered. Success was shared. Environmental knowledge was not abstract. It was embedded in daily life, reinforced through ritual, story, and responsibility. Children learned through participation. Skills were not separated from values. Stewardship was not an ideology. It was a necessity. Trade networks connected distant regions long before European contact. These networks extended across thousands of miles, linking communities that never met directly but depended on one another indirectly. Copper from the Great Lakes, shells from coastal regions, obsidian from the west, and agricultural products from fertile valleys moved along established routes. These networks were not informal or incidental. They were governed by diplomacy, ritual, and obligation. Trade reinforced relationships. Exchange established trust. Goods carried meaning beyond material value. They signaled alliance, respect, and continuity. Trade was as much about maintaining balance as acquiring resources. America was already connected. Ideas moved alongside goods. Technologies spread. Agricultural practices diffused. Cultural influences crossed regions gradually rather than abruptly. Change occurred through contact and adaptation rather than conquest. Governance existed in many forms. Some societies relied on councils and consensus building, where decisions required broad agreement and careful deliberation. Others maintained hereditary leadership or clan-based authority. In many cases, leadership was situational, tied to specific responsibilities rather than permanent power. Authority was often distributed rather than centralized. Leaders were expected to persuade rather than command. Influence depended on trust, reputation, and demonstrated responsibility. Leadership could be withdrawn if it failed to serve the community. Power was not absolute. It was relational. Land was not understood as a commodity. Territory carried responsibility rather than ownership. Use of land was negotiated through relationships rather than enforced through permanent boundaries. Boundaries existed, but they were flexible and contextual, shaped by memory, agreement, and shared understanding rather than fixed lines. Conflict occurred. Disputes over territory, resources, and influence were part of life. Alliances formed and dissolved. Warfare existed, but it followed cultural rules shaped by necessity and restraint. Conflict coexisted with diplomacy rather than replacing it. Violence was not absent, but it was contextual. The goal was rarely annihilation. It was balance, deterrence, or resolution. Warfare was bounded by cultural expectation and environmental reality. Spiritual belief was embedded in daily life. The natural world was not separate from the human world. Animals, weather, landforms, and seasons carried meaning. Spiritual practices reinforced balance, continuity, and responsibility rather than domination. Knowledge was transmitted orally through story, ceremony, and lived example. These stories encoded practical knowledge, moral expectations, and historical memory. They explained how to live within the world rather than above it. Time was understood cyclically. Continuity mattered more than accumulation. Stability mattered more than expansion. Growth for its own sake was not a universal goal. Endurance was. These systems were not static. They evolved over time in response to climate change, population movement, internal conflict, and innovation. Agricultural practices adapted to shifting conditions. Settlement patterns changed when environments demanded it. Innovation was absorbed gradually and integrated into tradition rather than replacing it. Population density varied widely. Some regions supported large populations organized into complex societies with layered governance and economic specialization. Others supported smaller, mobile groups adapted to harsher or more variable environments. These differences reflected ecological reality rather than capability. Knowledge systems were precise. Observation over generations produced deep understanding of animal behavior, plant cycles, weather patterns, and terrain. Survival depended on accuracy. Error carried cost. By the time European contact approached, this world had coherence. It was not uniform. It was not peaceful everywhere. But it was established. Societies understood their environments. Relationships between people, nations, and land were governed by precedent, obligation, and memory. This mattered. Understanding this coherence requires letting go of later assumptions. European observers would later describe the continent in terms that reflected their own expectations. They saw land that appeared open, forests that seemed unmanaged, and societies that did not resemble centralized states. From these observations, they drew conclusions that were incomplete at best and misleading at worst. What they did not see were the systems operating beneath the surface. Many indigenous societies organized life around principles that did not prioritize accumulation or territorial expansion. Wealth was measured differently. Security was derived from relationships rather than possession. Stability came from balance rather than growth. These values shaped interaction with the land and with one another. Agricultural surplus, where it existed, was not always used to fuel expansion. It was often used to buffer against scarcity. Storage, redistribution, and communal responsibility mattered more than individual accumulation. This approach reduced risk in environments where conditions could change rapidly. In regions where mobility was central, social organization supported movement rather than permanence. Homes were designed to be assembled and disassembled. Belongings were limited to what could be carried. Knowledge traveled with people rather than remaining fixed to place. Mobility required discipline. Routes were remembered. Seasonal timing mattered. Miscalculation carried cost. These societies developed mental maps and oral records that preserved geographic knowledge across generations. Landscapes were known intimately. Rivers were not just waterways, but guides. Mountain ranges were reference points. Plains were understood through patterns of movement rather than borders. Orientation relied on experience rather than abstraction. This familiarity created resilience. When conditions changed, societies adjusted. Drought, flood, or cold did not necessarily trigger collapse. They triggered movement, adaptation, and reorganization. Survival depended on flexibility rather than rigidity. This flexibility did not imply disorder. It required coordination, shared knowledge, and trust. Social structures reinforced this trust. Kinship networks extended beyond immediate family. Obligation flowed outward rather than inward alone. Responsibility was collective. Decisions accounted for impact on future seasons as well as immediate need. Memory played a central role. History was preserved through narrative rather than record. Stories carried instruction. They explained why certain places were avoided, why certain practices were followed, and why certain relationships mattered. These narratives encoded lessons learned through hardship and success. Ignoring these lessons carried consequence. Spiritual systems reinforced these values. Rituals aligned behavior with seasonal cycles. Ceremonies marked transitions in life and environment. These practices reinforced continuity and responsibility rather than control. The human world and the natural world were not separate domains. They were interdependent. This worldview shaped how conflict was understood. Disputes were not always resolved through force. Mediation, compensation, and ritual reconciliation were common. Warfare, when it occurred, followed patterns that limited escalation. The goal was often restoration of balance rather than domination. Power operated within constraint. Leaders who overreached lost legitimacy. Authority was maintained through service rather than coercion. Reputation mattered. Accountability existed even without formal institutions. This system was not perfect. It was human. But it functioned within the realities of the continent for generations. By the time Europeans approached the shores of North America, they were not entering an untouched world. They were encountering societies with deep histories, established relationships, and functional systems that had already endured significant change. This context matters because what followed was not the introduction of order into chaos. It was the collision of different ways of understanding land, power, and purpose, and that collision would unfold unevenly, unpredictably, and at enormous cost. The first effects of European contact were not immediately visible as settlement. They arrived as disruption. Diseases traveled faster than people. Pathogens carried across the Atlantic moved through trade routes and social networks before sustained contact occurred. Communities that had never seen Europeans experienced sudden illness and loss without understanding the cause. These losses destabilized societies. Knowledge keepers died. Leaders were lost. Social continuity fractured. Recovery was uneven and often incomplete. The effects rippled outward, altering relationships between nations and changing balances of power that had existed for generations. This disruption preceded colonization. It reshaped the world Europeans would later enter. Trade relationships followed disease. European goods entered existing networks and altered them. Metal tools, weapons, and textiles changed labor patterns and warfare dynamics. Access to these goods shifted influence between groups. Dependency formed quickly, sometimes unintentionally. Trade brought advantage. It also brought vulnerability. As reliance on foreign goods increased, traditional production declined in some regions. Balance was disrupted. Control over access became a source of power and conflict. Relationships that had once been reciprocal grew uneven. European assumptions intensified these effects. Land was viewed as property rather than responsibility. Ownership implied exclusion. Boundaries were fixed rather than relational. These concepts conflicted directly with existing systems and created friction wherever they were applied. Agreements were interpreted differently. Treaties were seen by indigenous nations as relationships requiring ongoing negotiation. Europeans often viewed them as permanent transfers. This mismatch created misunderstanding that compounded over time. Conflict followed misalignment. Not always immediately, but consistently. European governance structures emphasized central authority and hierarchy. Power flowed downward. Decisions were enforced rather than negotiated. This approach clashed with societies that valued consensus and situational leadership. Where authority was imposed without legitimacy, resistance emerged, sometimes openly. sometimes quietly. The pace of change accelerated. What had once evolved gradually now shifted abruptly. Systems designed for balance were strained by forces that did not account for long-term impact. Adaptation became harder as disruption multiplied. Communities responded differently. Some sought accommodation. Others resisted. Some migrated. Others reorganized internally. Survival strategies varied, but none were without cost. These responses shaped what followed. They influenced patterns of settlement, alliance, and conflict that would define the next centuries. By the time sustained European settlement began, the world it encountered was already altered. Not empty, not passive, but wounded and adapting. This context reframes the story. It reveals that colonization did not act upon a static world. It collided with societies already under strain. And that strain would shape every interaction that followed. European arrival did not occur as a single moment. It unfolded unevenly, differently in each region, shaped by geography, timing, and circumstance. Some areas experienced brief contact, followed by withdrawal. Others saw sustained interaction through trade long before permanent settlement. In all cases, indigenous societies were forced to respond to forces that did not operate according to existing expectations. The imbalance was not only technological, it was conceptual. European societies arrived with assumptions that framed land as something to be claimed, measured, and owned. Authority was centralized. Expansion was treated as progress. Permanence was valued over flexibility. These assumptions were not universally shared, and they did not translate cleanly into the existing world they encountered. Where Europeans saw unused land, indigenous societies saw seasonal use. Where Europeans saw absence, indigenous societies saw relationship. This misreading had consequences. Settlements were established without understanding existing systems of land stewardship. Forests that had been managed through controlled burning were allowed to grow dense, altering ecosystems and increasing the risk of catastrophic fires. Agricultural practices disrupted soil that had been maintained through rotation and restraint. Environmental change accelerated, not because the land was incapable of sustaining life, but because the systems sustaining it were displaced. As European populations grew, pressure intensified. Demand for land expanded outward from coastal settlements. Boundaries hardened. Flexibility diminished. Negotiation gave way to enforcement. Agreements made under one understanding were enforced under another. Conflict followed, sometimes openly, sometimes through slow displacement. Indigenous nations were forced into repeated decisions under impossible conditions: accommodate and risk erosion of autonomy, resist and face violence, move and abandon ancestral lands, remain and endure pressure. None of these choices offered preservation. They offered survival. The effects of these pressures accumulated across generations. Social structures strained. Cultural practices adapted. Knowledge systems persisted where possible and fractured where loss was too great. Identity shifted under constraint. Yet endurance remained. Despite disruption, indigenous societies did not vanish. They adapted, resisted, negotiated, and survived. Their presence continued to shape the land, the economy, and the conflicts that followed. This persistence mattered. It challenges narratives that frame colonization as replacement rather than intrusion. It reveals continuity beneath change. It reminds us that history did not reset upon European arrival. It collided. Understanding America before arrival is not an exercise in nostalgia. It is a necessary foundation. Without it, later expansion appears natural rather than disruptive. Conflict appears inevitable rather than contingent. Progress appears neutral rather than costly. With it, the story changes. America was not discovered. It was encountered. And that encounter reshaped everyone involved. Part 1. The pressure to leave. Leaving did not begin with hope. For most people who eventually crossed the Atlantic, the idea of departure emerged slowly, not as a dream of opportunity, but as a response to constraint. Life did not collapse all at once. It narrowed. Options diminished. Stability weakened. What had once felt manageable became fragile, and then uncertain. Pressure accumulated quietly. In much of Europe, daily life was governed by systems that offered predictability but little flexibility. Social position was inherited. Occupation was often predetermined. Land was controlled through arrangements that favored continuity and discouraged disruption. For generations, this structure had functioned well enough to sustain communities. But conditions changed. Population growth placed strain on land and labor. Resources that once supported families no longer did. In rural areas, enclosure reduced access to common lands that had long provided grazing, fuel, and supplemental food. Fields that were once shared became restricted. Forests that once supplied firewood became guarded or sold. Displacement did not arrive suddenly. It arrived incrementally. A field lost, a right revoked, a rent increased, a customary agreement altered. Each change was survivable in isolation. Together, they became suffocating. Those who lost access to land did not immediately leave. They adjusted. They took on additional labor. They accepted lower returns. They borrowed. They delayed marriage. They reduced expectations. These strategies allowed families to endure for a time, but endurance had limits. Urban centers absorbed the displaced, but they offered little security. Cities grew crowded as rural populations migrated in search of work. Wages stagnated. Employment became irregular and seasonal. Competition intensified. Families lived close to the margin, where illness, injury, or a missed payment could trigger collapse. Work existed. Stability did not. Living conditions in cities reflected this precarity. Housing was crowded. Sanitation was poor. Disease spread easily. Families shared space with strangers. Privacy disappeared. Survival required constant effort, and even sustained effort did not guarantee security. For many, this was the first realization that effort and outcome were no longer reliably connected. Political and religious pressures compounded this instability. In many regions, conformity was linked to safety. Belief and practice were monitored unevenly, shifting with changes in leadership. What was tolerated under one authority could become punishable under another. Communities learned caution. Public expression narrowed. Dissent carried risk. Freedom was conditional. Security was temporary. Families adapted by becoming careful. Speech was measured. Behavior was moderated. Public disagreement was avoided. These adaptations preserved safety, but they also limited autonomy. Life became constrained not only economically, but socially. Information about the wider world circulated through rumor, letters, and word of mouth. News traveled slowly and unevenly. Stories of opportunity abroad mixed with warnings of hardship. America appeared in these accounts not as paradise, but as possibility. Possibility mattered. For those under sustained pressure, the existence of an alternative carried weight, even if its details were unclear. The idea of leaving did not promise success. It promised movement. It suggested that conditions might change rather than continue narrowing. For many families, this idea lingered for years. It surfaced during difficult seasons. It receded when conditions stabilized briefly. It returned when pressure resumed. Conversations happened quietly, often late at night, when work was finished and children were asleep. To speak of leaving was dangerous. It invited judgment. It suggested dissatisfaction. It implied failure. Leaving meant acknowledging that the life built within existing systems might no longer be viable. Yet the thought persisted, because staying no longer guaranteed survival, because effort no longer ensured stability, because the future felt increasingly constrained. Leaving became thinkable when staying became untenable. The pressure to leave was rarely driven by a single cause. It emerged from the convergence of many forces acting over time. Economic strain, social rigidity, political uncertainty, and environmental disruption layered together until resilience gave way to exhaustion. Families did not abandon their homes lightly. Departure was not an act of ambition. It was an act of calculation. In rural regions, land fragmentation accelerated instability. As populations grew, land holdings were divided among heirs. Each generation inherited smaller plots, often too small to sustain a family. What had once been productive farmland became marginal. Yields declined. Dependence on supplemental labor increased. Tenant farming expanded. Rent replaced ownership. Security diminished. Terms shifted unpredictably. Improvements made by tenants benefited landlords rather than families. Investment lost meaning when permanence was uncertain. Bad harvests intensified this vulnerability. Weather events that might once have been survivable became catastrophic under strained conditions. A single failed season could exhaust reserves. Debt followed. Recovery was slow, if it came at all. Environmental pressures were not evenly distributed. Flooding, drought, and soil depletion affected regions differently, but their impact was magnified where social systems offered little flexibility. Those without land or capital absorbed the greatest risk. Survival depended increasingly on circumstances beyond individual control. Social mobility remained limited. Opportunities for advancement were constrained by class and connection. Skill did not guarantee progress. Education was unevenly accessible. Occupations passed from parent to child. Deviating from inherited roles required permission, patronage, or luck. For many, the future appeared predetermined. Marriage reinforced this reality. Families formed under economic pressure. Children arrived into constrained circumstances. Obligations multiplied while options diminished. Responsibility increased without corresponding opportunity. These conditions bred frustration. But frustration alone did not compel departure. Hope did. Hope that somewhere else, effort might matter again. Hope that land might be accessible. Hope that labor might lead to stability rather than survival. America entered this equation imperfectly. Stories circulated of land availability, of wages paid for work, of religious tolerance, of communities formed by people who had chosen to leave rather than remain constrained. These stories were incomplete and often exaggerated, but they introduced an idea that mattered deeply: choice. The possibility of choosing a different future carried weight disproportionate to its certainty. Religious minorities felt this pull acutely. Groups facing discrimination, restriction, or persecution saw departure not as escape, but as preservation. Maintaining belief required distance from authority. Practice required space. The promise of tolerance, even if conditional, outweighed the certainty of constraint. Political uncertainty reinforced this calculus. Shifts in power altered expectations quickly, policies changed, allegiances shifted, rights expanded and contracted. Stability depended on alignment with authority rather than principle. Those outside favored groups lived cautiously. Security was provisional. In this environment, America represented not freedom, but distance. Distance from oversight, distance from obligation, distance from systems that no longer served. Leaving was not framed as rejection of homeland, it was framed as necessity, and necessity reframes risk. What once seemed reckless began to feel reasonable. What once seemed impossible began to feel inevitable. The pressure to leave did not explode outward. It compressed inward, until movement became the only release. The decision to leave did not arrive cleanly. It formed slowly, shaped by hesitation as much as resolve. For many families, the idea existed long before action followed. It remained unspoken, revisited privately, weighed against obligations and fear. Leaving was not only a physical act, it was a psychological rupture. Home was not just a place, it was identity. To leave meant accepting that the world one understood no longer guaranteed survival. It required acknowledging that tradition, inheritance, and loyalty could no longer provide stability. This realization carried emotional weight that rivaled any practical concern. Families debated quietly. Parents worried about children. Children worried about parents. Elders feared being left behind. Younger generations feared being trapped. Each perspective pulled in a different direction. Leaving demanded consensus, and consensus was hard. Possessions became symbols of this conflict. Objects accumulated over lifetimes carried memory and meaning. Tools represented skill. Furniture represented permanence. Land represented continuity. Selling these items was not merely financial, it was final. Once sold, return became unlikely. This process unfolded gradually. Families sold what they could not carry. Livestock went first. Furniture followed. Tools were sold reluctantly, often at unfavorable prices. Buyers knew sellers lacked leverage. Time pressed. Value declined. Each sale narrowed the path back. Debt entered the equation. Passage across the Atlantic required capital that few families possessed outright. Savings were rare. Credit became necessary. Some borrowed from relatives. Others entered agreements that promised repayment through labor after arrival. These arrangements varied widely. Some were negotiated fairly, many were not. Terms were often vague. Power favored those who controlled opportunity on the other side of the ocean. Once agreed, withdrawal was difficult. The decision to leave reshaped relationships. Those who stayed behind inherited responsibility. Land was redistributed. Obligations shifted. Families fractured geographically, sometimes permanently. Letters would follow if fortune allowed. Visits would not. Goodbyes were not dramatic. They were restrained. Public emotion risked scrutiny. Grief was private. Departure was framed as practical rather than emotional. Tears were suppressed. Words were chosen carefully. The finality was understood, even if unspoken. Once the decision became action, momentum accelerated. Delays increased risk. Prices fluctuated. Employment obligations returned. Hesitation could undo months of preparation. Those who committed learned quickly that retreat was harder than departure. Departure demanded resolve, not optimism. Resolve carried people forward when certainty was absent. It allowed families to act despite incomplete information. It transformed fear into movement. Departure day arrived without ceremony. There were no public celebrations, no formal acknowledgments of what was being abandoned. Movement was quiet, deliberate, and restrained. Families traveled with what they could carry, often under the cover of routine, blending departure into ordinary activity to avoid attention. Ports were crowded but impersonal. People arrived from different regions, drawn together by circumstance rather than community. Languages mixed, customs collided. Anxiety was shared but rarely discussed. Everyone carried a private burden into a public space. Waiting intensified uncertainty. Ships did not depart on schedule. Weather delayed movement. Officials inspected documents and cargo. Fees accumulated unexpectedly. Resources diminished while families remained suspended between past and future. Control slipped away. Once passage was secured, authority shifted to ship owners, agents, and captains. Promises made inland lost relevance at the port. Conditions were renegotiated implicitly rather than explicitly. Options narrowed. This loss of control was sobering. It marked the first irreversible step. The journey had not yet begun, but retreat was no longer realistic. What remained was endurance. America at this moment was still abstract. It existed as rumor, possibility, and projection. Its reality would not be known until arrival, and even then, only partially. Expectations were vague. Certainty was absent. But departure had occurred. The pressure that once compressed life inward had been released through motion. Whether that motion would lead to stability or hardship remained unknown. What mattered was that movement had replaced stagnation. The choice to leave reshaped identity. People who departed were no longer simply members of a village, parish, or trade. They became migrants. Their lives would be defined by transition rather than continuity. Adaptation would become permanent. This shift altered perspective. Loss was reframed as sacrifice. Uncertainty became necessity. Fear became companion rather than barrier. The decision to leave was not heroic. It was human. It reflected a refusal to accept narrowing possibility as fate. It acknowledged risk without romanticizing it. It chose movement over immobility when remaining promised only further constraint. Part 1 ends not with arrival, but with separation. The old world recedes. The crossing awaits. Part 2. The journey begins. The journey did not begin at sea. It began with movement away from familiarity. Leaving a village, a town, or a neighborhood was often more disorienting than crossing the ocean itself. Roads that had once defined the boundaries of daily life became routes of departure. Each mile traveled inland toward a port increased the sense of separation. Travel was slow and uncertain. Most families moved on foot or by wagon, carrying what they could manage themselves. Roads were uneven. Lodging was inconsistent. Delays were common. Travel required coordination, money, and endurance long before a ship was ever boarded. Ports were overwhelming. They were louder, more crowded, and less personal than anything many travelers had experienced. People arrived from different regions, speaking different languages, carrying different expectations. The shared condition was uncertainty. Ports were not gateways of welcome. They were points of transaction. Agents, brokers, and ship owners controlled access to passage. Information was uneven. Promises were made quickly and forgotten just as fast. Those unfamiliar with port systems were at disadvantage from the moment they arrived. Money changed hands repeatedly. Fees appeared unexpectedly. Storage cost money. Food cost more than expected. Delays consumed resources. Families watched their savings shrink while they waited for departure. Waiting tested resolve. Days stretched into weeks. Ships were delayed by weather, inspection, or repair. Passage dates shifted without explanation. Each delay increased anxiety. Resources dwindled while the future remained abstract. Illness spread easily in crowded port cities. Poor sanitation and close quarters created ideal conditions for disease. Travelers arrived already weakened by stress and poor nutrition. Children were especially vulnerable. Some families lost members before departure ever occurred. There was no compensation. Departure did not pause for loss. Once passage was finally secured, authority shifted decisively. Control over movement, timing, and conditions transferred to ship owners and captains. Agreements made inland lost relevance at the dock. Passengers became cargo. Ships were not designed for people. They were designed for profit. Human accommodation was secondary. Space was allocated minimally. Comfort was not a priority. Boarding marked the first irreversible step. The land receded. The ship became the world. Once aboard, the reality of the journey became immediate. The transition from land to ship was abrupt. Space narrowed. Movement became restricted. The sounds of the port faded and were replaced by creaking wood, shouted commands, and the constant movement of water against the hull. For many passengers, this was their first experience at sea. Ships were crowded. Passenger accommodations were typically located below deck in areas never intended for long-term human occupancy. Ceilings were low, light was scarce, ventilation was poor. Families were assigned narrow spaces where they would live, eat, and sleep for the duration of the crossing. Privacy disappeared. Men, women, and children shared confined quarters with strangers. Personal boundaries dissolved under necessity. Noise was constant. The ship never truly rested, and neither did those aboard it. Seasickness spread quickly. Few passengers were prepared for the motion of the Atlantic. The constant pitching and rolling disoriented bodies already weakened by stress and poor nutrition. Vomiting was common. Dehydration followed. Strength diminished rapidly during the first days at sea. Clean water was rationed. Fresh water supplies were limited and carefully controlled. Washing was rare. Clothing remained damp. Bedding absorbed moisture and odors. Hygiene deteriorated quickly, creating conditions where illness could spread unchecked. Food was monotonous and insufficient. Rations consisted largely of hard biscuits, salted meat, dried grains, and whatever provisions families had managed to bring with them. Spoilage was common. Weevils infested flour. Meat turned rancid. Hunger became a constant presence. Cooking was limited. Fires were dangerous aboard wooden ships, so hot meals were infrequent. When cooking did occur, it was tightly regulated. Many passengers relied on cold food, even in harsh conditions. Children suffered most. Their bodies were less resilient to hunger, illness, and confinement. Parents struggled to protect them in an environment that offered little safety. Crying carried through the ship, a reminder of vulnerability shared by all aboard. Disease found fertile ground. Crowded quarters, poor ventilation, and limited sanitation allowed fevers, infections, and respiratory illnesses to spread rapidly. Once illness appeared, there were few effective treatments. Ship surgeons, when present, were limited in what they could do. Isolation intensified fear. Passengers had little understanding of how far they had traveled or how long the journey would last. Days blended together. Time lost meaning. Progress was measured emotionally rather than geographically. Despite hardship, Routines emerged. Passengers adapted. Daily patterns formed around ration distribution, limited movement on deck, and shared responsibilities. Small communities developed within the confined space, bound by shared endurance rather than shared origin. Mutual aid mattered. Those who remained stronger assisted those who weakened. Skills were shared. Comfort was offered where possible. These small acts did not eliminate suffering, but they made survival more likely. Below deck, the journey became a test of endurance. Above deck, the sea remained indifferent. Time at sea stretched unpredictably. Atlantic crossings did not follow schedules. Wind determined progress more than intention. Favorable currents could shorten a voyage, but storms or calm seas could stall ships for weeks. Passengers had no control over this uncertainty and little information about their position. Storms tested endurance. When weather turned, the ship became violent. Waves struck the hull with force. Water seeped into living spaces. Cargo shifted. Darkness below deck intensified fear as the ship pitched and rolled without warning. Movement was restricted during storms. Passengers were often confined below deck for safety. Air grew stagnant. Seasickness worsened. Panic spread easily in confined spaces where escape was impossible. Prayers were whispered or shouted, depending on belief and fear. Damage was common. Rigging tore, sails split, leaks developed. Crews worked constantly to keep ships seaworthy. Passengers watched helplessly as their fate depended on skill and luck rather than effort. Calm seas carried their own danger. Without wind, ships drifted. Days passed without measurable progress. Rations were reduced to conserve supplies. Water was rationed more strictly. Anxiety deepened as uncertainty extended the journey. Navigation relied on experience. Instruments were limited. Charts were imperfect. Position was estimated rather than known. Errors accumulated. Routes varied. Passengers could not judge progress and were often misled by optimism or rumor. Time lost structure. Days blended together. The absence of routine markers disrupted sleep and perception. Illness distorted awareness. Survival narrowed focus to immediate needs. Death occurred quietly. Illness, injury, and exhaustion claimed lives during the crossing. When someone died, there was little ceremony. Bodies were wrapped and committed to the sea. Grief had no space to linger. The journey continued. Those who witnessed death understood the finality of departure. The ocean marked a boundary that could not be crossed again. Loss became part of the cost of movement. Faith became refuge for some. Prayer offered structure where none existed. Reflection provided meaning where progress was unclear. For others, faith faltered under sustained hardship. Fear persisted. Fear of storms. Fear of illness. Fear of never reaching land. Fear of what awaited if land was reached. Yet endurance replaced optimism. Survival became the measure of success. Hope narrowed to the immediate goal of reaching shore alive. The crossing transformed passengers. Those who boarded with expectation arrived with resolve. The journey stripped illusion and replaced it with endurance. The ocean demanded it. Signs of land did not always bring relief. As the crossing neared its end, anticipation mixed with exhaustion. Birds appeared. The color of the water shifted. Debris drifted past the ship. Rumors spread quickly through the passengers, rising and falling with each false sign. When land finally came into view, reactions varied. Some felt relief, others felt fear. Many felt nothing at all, numbed by weeks of strain. Arrival did not signal safety. It signaled transition into another unknown. Ships rarely docked immediately. They waited offshore for inspection and clearance. Authorities boarded to examine passengers and cargo. Illness delayed disembarkation. Those suspected of disease were isolated. Entire ships could be quarantined for days or weeks. Conditions worsened during quarantine. Rations ran low. Water supplies tightened. Tempers frayed. The hope of arrival became another test of endurance rather than a conclusion. When disembarkation finally occurred, it was chaotic. Passengers were processed quickly. Names were recorded inaccurately. Ages were guessed. Origins were misunderstood or ignored. Families were separated temporarily or permanently in the confusion. There was no orientation, no guidance. Those who arrived with contacts moved quickly inland. Those without connections lingered near ports, uncertain where to go or how to begin. Shelter was temporary. Work was uncertain. Debt followed families across the ocean. America did not present itself as promise. It presented itself as demand. Survival required immediate action. Labor was sought quickly. Skills were tested without regard for origin. Mistakes carried consequence. Protection was minimal. Those who arrived alone faced isolation. Those who arrived with family faced pressure. The journey had ended. The reckoning had not. Part 2 concludes not with settlement, but with arrival stripped of certainty. The ocean had been crossed. The cost had been paid. What remained was adaptation. The old world was gone. The new world had not yet taken shape. Part 3. First steps in a new world arrival did not mark completion. It marked exposure. The moment passengers stepped off the ship, they entered an environment that offered little protection and no clear guidance. Ports were crowded, loud, and transactional. Officials processed arrivals quickly, often inaccurately. Names were altered. Ages were guessed. Origins were misunderstood or ignored. For many, this was the first realization that identity was fragile. What had once been known and recognized was now reduced to fragments recorded by strangers. Errors went uncorrected. Confusion became permanent. Documentation followed people forward, shaping opportunity regardless of accuracy. Those with contacts moved quickly. Family members, employers, or sponsors provided direction. Housing was arranged. Work began immediately. These connections did not guarantee success, but they reduced vulnerability. Those without connections lingered. Ports offered temporary shelter at best. Inns were overcrowded and expensive. Unscrupulous operators exploited confusion. Theft was common. Debt accumulated quickly as survival costs mounted. Time mattered. The longer someone remained near the port without work, the more precarious their situation became. Resources dwindled. Desperation increased. Decisions were made under pressure rather than planning. Work was sought immediately. Skills that had once been respected were often disregarded. Trades did not transfer cleanly. Experience carried less weight than willingness. Physical labor was abundant, but unstable. Wages were low. Conditions were harsh. Employers held advantage. Contracts were informal or non-existent. Terms shifted without warning. Payment was delayed or reduced. Complaints carried risk. Replacement labor was always available. For many, this was the second shock. The first had been the crossing. The second was realization that arrival did not equal opportunity. Housing reflected this imbalance. Living arrangements were temporary, crowded, and expensive. Families shared rooms with strangers. Privacy disappeared again. Disease remained a threat. Stability was elusive. Urban environments intensified stress. Cities grew rapidly, absorbing migrants faster than infrastructure could support them. Sanitation lagged. Clean water was inconsistent. Fire posed constant danger. Entire neighborhoods were vulnerable to collapse. Rural opportunity existed, but access was limited. Land was available, but not always where promised or under expected terms. Travel inland required resources. Knowledge of terrain was limited. Isolation carried risk. Success depended on timing, weather, and endurance. For many, movement continued. Arrival was not settlement. It was transition. The pressure to adapt replaced the pressure to leave. Survival required flexibility. Expectations adjusted quickly. Optimism narrowed. Endurance expanded. America revealed itself not as refuge, but as demand. Those who remained learned this quickly. Adaptation required speed. There was little time to recover from the journey or to process loss. Survival in the new environment demanded immediate adjustment. Customs that had governed life before departure no longer applied. Social expectations shifted. Authority operated differently. Assumptions had to be relearned quickly. Language created barriers. Even those who spoke some form of English found that dialect, accent, and vocabulary marked them as outsiders. Misunderstanding limited opportunity. Communication errors carried consequence in workplaces where mistakes could result in injury or dismissal. Those who spoke little or no English faced greater isolation. They relied on informal networks formed by shared origin or language. These communities provided limited support, but also limited mobility. Opportunities circulated within narrow circles. Integration was slow and uneven. Work structured daily life. Hours were long. Tasks were repetitive. Safety was minimal. Injuries were common and often untreated. Illness meant lost wages. There was no buffer against interruption. Children worked alongside adults. Their labor supplemented family income. Education was secondary to survival. Childhood shortened under economic pressure. Families made these decisions reluctantly but out of necessity. Women carried additional burdens. Domestic labor continued alongside paid work. Care for children, preparation of food, and maintenance of living spaces persisted despite exhaustion. Employment options for women were limited and poorly compensated. Household survival depended on coordination. Every member contributed. Absence or failure had immediate effect. There was little margin for error. Social stratification emerged quickly. Those who arrived with resources, education, or connections advanced more easily. Those without remained vulnerable. Class distinctions hardened along lines of origin, skill, and access. Discrimination reinforced these divisions. Ethnic and religious prejudice shaped opportunity. Entire communities were labeled unreliable or inferior. Exclusion from certain trades, neighborhoods, or institutions was enforced formally and informally. Adaptation did not erase identity, it reshaped it. Cultural practices persisted where possible. Food, language, and ritual preserved continuity. These practices offered comfort but also marked difference. Balance was difficult. Assimilation promised opportunity but risked erasure. Separation preserved identity but limited mobility. Families navigated these tensions without clear guidance. Time softened some barriers. Experience replaced confusion. Skills adapted. Networks expanded. Survival strategies improved. Stability emerged gradually for some. For others, instability remained. The new world did not distribute reward evenly. Adaptation required endurance rather than expectation. Those who endured learned to navigate systems that did not bend easily. America did not accommodate, it tested. Community became a survival mechanism. Those who endured did so rarely in isolation. Informal networks formed quickly among people who shared language, origin, trade, or circumstance. These connections provided information, temporary shelter, childcare, and access to work. They did not eliminate hardship, but they reduced vulnerability. Neighborhoods took shape around necessity. Housing clustered near places of employment. Overcrowding was common. Entire families occupied single rooms. Lodging houses filled beyond capacity. Privacy was sacrificed for proximity to work and affordability. Disease followed density. Outbreaks of illness moved rapidly through crowded neighborhoods. Medical care was limited and often unaffordable. Many relied on home remedies or community knowledge. Recovery depended on resilience rather than treatment. Despite hardship, routines emerged. Daily life settled into patterns defined by work schedules, religious observance, and shared obligation. Markets formed. Mutual aid societies appeared. Religious institutions became anchors, offering structure, familiarity, and support. These institutions mattered deeply. They preserved language and custom. They offered moral authority where legal authority was distant or indifferent. They mediated disputes. They provided charity when formal systems failed. Education remained uneven. Some children attended school irregularly. Others worked full-time. Literacy improved slowly. Opportunity expanded unevenly, shaped by family circumstance rather than individual potential. Generational divides appeared. Children adapted more quickly than parents. Language acquisition was faster. Cultural norms shifted. Identity became layered rather than singular. Parents feared loss of tradition. Children sought acceptance. Tension followed. Households navigated conflicting expectations. Respect for heritage competed with pressure to conform. These negotiations shaped identity in lasting ways. Work continued to dominate life. Advancement was possible, but uncertain. Success depended on timing, health, and luck as much as effort. Injuries or illness could erase years of progress. Security remained fragile. Some moved again. When conditions stagnated, families relocated within cities or moved inland. Mobility did not guarantee improvement, but it preserved possibility. Movement became a recurring strategy rather than a single event. This pattern repeated. Adaptation was ongoing. The idea of arrival as an endpoint dissolved. Life became defined by adjustment rather than settlement. For many, this was the true transition, not from one place to another, but from certainty to contingency. Over time, survival began to resemble stability. For some, steady work led to predictable income. Housing improved incrementally. Crowded rooms gave way to shared apartments. Temporary arrangements became semi-permanent. These changes were modest, but they mattered. Security remained conditional. Employment could vanish without warning. Economic downturns rippled quickly through working communities. Layoffs spread. Wages fell. Families returned to strategies of pooling resources and relying on extended networks. The experience reshaped expectations. Success was measured differently. Advancement was gradual rather than transformative. Progress meant avoiding collapse rather than achieving comfort. This recalibration reflected learned reality. Political awareness grew. Living within new systems forced engagement with unfamiliar institutions. Laws governed labor, housing, and movement. Participation was uneven and often restricted, But awareness increased as communities learned how power operated. Some organized. Labor movements emerged. Mutual aid expanded. Collective action offered leverage where individual effort failed. These movements faced resistance, but they introduced new possibilities for change. Belonging evolved slowly. Identity became layered. People learned to navigate multiple worlds, shifting behavior depending on context. Public conformity coexisted with private continuity. Adaptation did not require abandonment, but it demanded flexibility. The meaning of home changed. Home became less about origin and more about presence. It was defined by people rather than place. Memory persisted, but it no longer dictated survival. This shift marked a turning point. The initial vulnerability of arrival gave way to negotiation. Immigrants were no longer only reacting. They were participating, influencing, and shaping the environments they inhabited. America remained demanding. It did not guarantee reward, but it offered space for persistence. Part 3 concludes with transformation underway rather than complete. The process of settlement had begun, but stability was neither universal nor assured. The journey had moved beyond movement. It had become adaptation. Part 4. Building lives and communities. Settlement did not arrive as permanence. It arrived as negotiation. For those who remained after the first years, life became a process of building within constraint. Stability was not granted. It was constructed slowly through repetition, adaptation, and endurance. What had once been emergency survival shifted into long-term management of risk. Work anchored daily life. Employment remained central to survival, but patterns evolved. Skills adapted. Experience accumulated. Workers learned which employers were reliable and which were not. Informal reputations formed. Trust, once scarce, developed selectively. Some found niches. Trades adjusted to new markets. Craft knowledge transferred unevenly, but where demand existed, opportunity followed. Artisans found ways to apply old skills in new contexts. Labor that once seemed interchangeable gained differentiation over time. For many, advancement was incremental. Small wage increases, more consistent hours, slightly better housing. These changes rarely transformed status, but they reduced vulnerability. Progress was measured in stability rather than prosperity. Housing reflected this shift. Temporary lodgings gave way to shared apartments or modest homes. Crowding remained common, but permanence increased. Neighborhoods stabilized as families remained rather than moving constantly. Familiar faces replaced strangers. Ownership remained distant. Renting dominated working-class life. Property acquisition required capital few possessed. Even those who purchased homes did so cautiously, aware that loss could follow quickly. Community formed through proximity. Neighbors relied on one another for childcare, shared resources, and information. Trust developed unevenly, shaped by shared experience rather than shared origin alone. Daily interaction reinforced obligation. Institutions strengthened. Religious congregations expanded their role beyond worship. They organized education, charity, and mediation. Mutual aid societies formalized support that had once been informal. These structures reduced isolation and provided continuity. Belonging deepened gradually. Participation replaced arrival as the marker of settlement. Those who contributed gained recognition. Those who remained disengaged remained vulnerable. Integration was behavioral rather than symbolic. Conflict persisted. Competition for work, housing, and resources generated tension within and between communities. Prejudice reinforced division. Boundaries hardened in some areas even as cooperation expanded in others. Adaptation required balance. Preserving identity offered continuity. Adjusting behavior offered opportunity. Families navigated these tensions without clear resolution. Choices carried consequence across generations. Children became bridges. They learned language and customs more quickly. Education expanded their options. They navigated spaces unavailable to their parents. This mobility reshaped family dynamics and expectations. For parents, this shift was complex. Pride mixed with fear. Advancement required distance from tradition. Success came with transformation. Continuity was negotiated rather than assumed. The process was uneven. Some families stabilized within a decade. Others remained precarious for generations. Outcome depended on health, timing, location, and luck as much as effort. America did not equalize. It stratified. Those who endured learned to operate within this reality. Community became both shield and limitation. Stability emerged not through promise, but through persistence. Settlement, when it came, was earned rather than granted. As community stabilized, relationships with the broader society became unavoidable. Interaction with local authorities increased. Laws governing housing, labor, education, and public behavior shaped daily life. Compliance was often required for survival, even when systems felt distant or unresponsive. Legal knowledge mattered. Those who understood regulations navigated them more effectively. Others learned through consequence. Fines, eviction, or job loss taught lessons quickly. Access to legal assistance was limited. Misunderstanding carried cost. Political participation remained restricted. Voting rights were unevenly accessible. Eligibility depended on status, literacy, and local policy. Engagement was often discouraged or actively suppressed. Yet awareness of political power grew as communities recognized how decisions affected their lives. Informal influence developed where formal access was denied. Community leaders emerged. Advocates negotiated with employers, landlords, and officials. Representation did not always succeed, but it provided a channel for communication that had not existed before. Education expanded slowly. Public schooling became more accessible, though unevenly funded and inconsistently attended. Children balanced education with work. Attendance fluctuated with family need. Literacy increased, but opportunity followed unevenly. Schools became sites of transformation. Language acquisition accelerated assimilation. Cultural norms were reinforced. Children absorbed expectations that differed from those held by their parents. This created opportunity, but also tension. Economic diversification followed. As industries expanded, employment options widened. Manufacturing, transportation, and service work absorbed labor. These sectors offered different risks and rewards. Some provided stability. Others introduced new hazards. Workplace organization increased. Labor groups formed to advocate for safer conditions, fair wages, and predictable hours. Collective action challenged employer dominance. Resistance was common. Progress was incremental and contested. These movements reshaped expectations. The idea that conditions could improve through organization gained traction. Participation carried risk, but also potential. Community solidarity extended beyond immediate survival. Cultural life adapted. Festivals, music, and food preserved heritage while evolving in new contexts. Public expression balanced celebration with caution. Identity became both visible and guarded. Religion continued to anchor community. Institutions mediated conflict, supported the vulnerable, and reinforced continuity. They provided moral authority and practical assistance where state systems fell short. Belonging deepened through contribution. Participation in community life increased recognition and security. Isolation diminished as relationships strengthened. Stability became relational rather than guaranteed. Yet inequality persisted. Opportunity expanded unevenly. Advancement remained contingent on factors beyond control. The promise of mobility existed, but access varied widely. Communities learned to operate within these constraints. Adaptation became institutional rather than individual. Settlement was no longer provisional. It was evolving. Over time, community identity became more complex. As families remained in place, differences within immigrant populations became more visible. Economic status, occupation, and access to education began to separate neighbors who had once shared similar struggles. Some advanced. Others remained close to the margins. These divisions reshaped relationships. Solidarity persisted, but it was no longer universal. Shared origin mattered less than shared circumstance. Neighborhoods reflected stratification as much as unity. Aspirations diverged. Mobility increased for some. Children who received education accessed opportunities unavailable to their parents. They moved into skilled trades, clerical work, or professional roles. This mobility altered family dynamics and expectations. Authority shifted subtly across generations. For parents, success carried ambiguity. Advancement brought security, but also distance from tradition. Language changed, customs adapted, identity layered rather than replaced. Pride coexisted with concern. Housing patterns reflected this transition. Those who advanced moved to less crowded areas. Neighborhood composition shifted. New arrivals filled vacated spaces. Cycles of movement repeated as opportunity redistributed populations. Public perception evolved unevenly. Some communities gained acceptance over time. Others remained stigmatized. Stereotypes hardened or softened depending on political climate, economic conditions, and visibility. Acceptance was conditional rather than assured. Media reinforced these perceptions. Narratives framed immigrants alternately as contributors or threats. Visibility increased scrutiny. Representation mattered, but control over representation was limited. Economic cycles intensified vulnerability. Boom periods expanded opportunity. Downturns erased progress quickly. Communities learned that stability was reversible. Preparation replaced optimism. Resilient strategies evolved. Savings increased where possible. Mutual aid strengthened. Families diversified income sources. Risk management became learned behavior rather than instinct. Civic engagement grew cautiously. Participation in local organizations increased influence without requiring formal power. Advocacy focused on practical outcomes rather than ideology. Incremental change replaced sweeping ambition. Education emerged as leverage. Investment in schooling became central to long-term strategy. Families prioritized attendance where possible. Literacy and credentialing offered mobility that labor alone could not. This focus reshaped values. Sacrifice shifted toward future gain. Immediate comfort was traded for long-term possibility. This recalibration reflected adaptation to systemic reality. Belonging deepened unevenly. Some felt integrated. Others remained peripheral. Identity remained negotiated rather than resolved. Stability existed, but permanence felt conditional. Community life matured. Structures became formal. Leadership stabilized, memory accumulated, experience replaced uncertainty. Settlement, once provisional, became generational. The struggle changed form, but it did not disappear. By the time settlement reached a second generation, its meaning had changed. The children of those who arrived no longer measured life against what had been left behind. Their reference point was the present rather than the past. Memory became inherited rather than lived. Stories replaced experience. This shift altered expectations. What had once been survival-driven became opportunity-driven. Stability, though still fragile, felt attainable. Risk remained, but it was approached differently. The urgency that defined arrival softened into calculation. Institutions reflected this transition. Schools expanded their influence. Civic organizations formalized participation. Neighborhood associations emerged to manage shared concerns. These structures offered predictability where none had existed before. Cultural expression evolved. Traditions persisted, but they adapted. Language blended. Rituals changed form. Identity became hybrid rather than singular. Preservation occurred through evolution rather than stasis. Economic participation diversified further. Second-generation workers entered occupations that required literacy, certification, or specialized training. Barriers remained, but pathways widened. Success varied, but possibility expanded. This progress was uneven. Discrimination continued to shape outcome. Opportunity was influenced by geography, policy, and perception. Advancement remained contingent rather than guaranteed, yet endurance accumulated. The experience of arrival, adaptation, and negotiation produced resilience. Communities learned how systems operated and how to navigate them. Knowledge replaced uncertainty. Political awareness matured. Engagement increased as communities recognized leverage. Voting, advocacy, and representation became tools rather than abstractions. Influence remained limited, but presence grew. Belonging remained conditional. Acceptance expanded, but boundaries persisted. Inclusion was negotiated rather than automatic. Identity continued to require balance between adaptation and continuity. The meaning of settlement shifted again. It was no longer about surviving the immediate aftermath of arrival. It was about shaping the environment that followed. Participation replaced reaction. Influence replaced invisibility. America did not resolve contradiction. It absorbed it. Part 4 concludes with communities established but not settled in finality. Stability existed, but it was dynamic rather than fixed. Progress had occurred, but it remained vulnerable. The story did not end. It continued, reshaped by those who endured. Art 5. Becoming American. Becoming American was not a moment. It was a process without a clear beginning or end. For those who remained, identity did not shift suddenly upon arrival or even upon settlement. It changed gradually, shaped by experience rather than declaration. What it meant to belong was learned over time, negotiated through daily life rather than granted by law or ceremony. Legal status lagged behind reality. Citizenship, where it existed, was often distant or inaccessible. Many lived for years or decades without formal recognition. Rights were uneven. Protections varied by region, occupation, and political climate. Yet participation occurred regardless of status. People worked. They paid rent. They raised children. They contributed labor, skill, and presence. Belonging was enacted before it was acknowledged. This gap mattered. It created tension between contribution and recognition. Communities understood themselves as part of the nation long before the nation fully accepted them. This imbalance shaped political awareness and social strategy. Language became a marker. Accent signaled origin. Fluency signaled adaptation. Speech influenced opportunity. Those who mastered language navigated systems more effectively. Those who did not remained constrained, regardless of skill or effort. Education accelerated transformation. Schooling exposed children to shared narratives and expectations. History, civics, and language instruction framed national identity in specific ways. Students absorbed these frameworks even as family stories offered alternatives. Identity layered rather than replaced. Children carried multiple reference points. Home reflected one set of values. School reflected another. Negotiating these spaces required flexibility. Belonging became situational rather than singular. Work reinforced this shift. Employment rewarded conformity to expected norms. Behavior, appearance, and communication mattered. Advancement depended on understanding unwritten rules as much as formal requirements. Assimilation promised access. It also demanded compromise. Cultural practices adapted under pressure. Some traditions faded, others transformed. Preservation occurred selectively, shaped by what could coexist with opportunity. Communities debated these changes internally. Some prioritized continuity, others prioritized mobility. These debates were rarely abstract. They shaped parenting, education, and social participation. Choices carried consequence across generations. Public identity became strategic. Visibility brought opportunity, but also scrutiny. In times of economic growth, inclusion expanded. In times of uncertainty, exclusion intensified. Acceptance fluctuated with circumstance. Belonging remained conditional. Loyalty was tested repeatedly. Communities were expected to demonstrate alignment during crisis. Suspicion resurfaced cyclically. Acceptance was never assumed. Despite this, investment deepened. People built lives rooted in place. They purchased property where possible. They established businesses. They engaged locally. Commitment increased even when recognition lagged. This investment reshaped expectations. Leaving became unthinkable. Return became abstract. The future oriented forward rather than backward. Becoming American did not require forgetting the past. It required learning how to navigate the present. And that navigation was ongoing. Civic participation followed lived experience. As communities stabilized, engagement with local institutions increased. People attended meetings, joined associations, and learned how decisions were made. Participation was practical rather than ideological. It focused on schools, housing, labor conditions, and public safety. Understanding systems became leverage. Those who learned how laws worked navigated them more effectively. Knowledge of procedures, deadlines, and authority structures reduced vulnerability. Others relied on community advocates who translated complexity into action. Political identity formed gradually. Alignment did not always follow ideology. It followed experience. Policies that affected work, housing, and education shaped loyalty more than abstract principle. Voting patterns reflected lived reality rather than inherited affiliation. Representation remained limited. Barriers to participation persisted. Literacy requirements, residency rules, and discrimination constrained access. Yet pressure for inclusion increased as communities demonstrated permanence and contribution. Public service emerged as pathway. Some entered civic roles directly. Teachers, organizers, and local officials acted as bridges between communities and institutions. Their presence shifted perception incrementally. Media shaped understanding. Narratives portrayed immigrants variably as contributors or threats. Visibility increased scrutiny. Public opinion fluctuated with economic and political climate. Communities learned to manage perception as well as reality. Economic integration continued unevenly. Some advanced into entrepreneurship. Small businesses anchored neighborhoods and provided employment. Ownership offered autonomy but carried risk. Failure was common. Success required endurance. Others remained in wage labor. Stability varied by industry. Technological change disrupted established roles. Adaptation was continuous. Skills required updating. Security remained conditional. Cultural expression persisted publicly. Festivals, food, and music offered visibility and continuity. Public celebration balanced pride with caution. Expression was shaped by acceptance and risk. Religion continued to provide structure. Institutions mediated conflict, supported families, and reinforced values. They offered continuity where external systems changed rapidly. Belonging deepened through contribution. Participation in shared spaces increased recognition. Presence normalized difference. Familiarity reduced suspicion over time. Yet boundaries remained. Acceptance expanded but was not universal. Inclusion remained negotiated rather than guaranteed. Identity required constant adjustment. Becoming American was not about arrival. It was about participation under constraint. Memory shaped identity as much as experience. As years passed, stories of arrival and hardship became shared reference points rather than immediate realities. These stories explained values, cautions, and expectations. They reminded younger generations of sacrifice, even as daily life moved further from those origins. Commemoration became selective. Certain moments were preserved while others faded. Success was emphasized. Failure was softened. Survival was framed as intention rather than circumstance. These narratives reinforced resilience, but sometimes obscured vulnerability. Education accelerated this shift. Formal schooling emphasized national history and civic identity. Children learned a shared story of belonging that differed from family memory. This divergence created tension but also possibility. Identity expanded rather than replaced. Workplace culture reinforced expectations. Professional norms rewarded predictability, punctuality, and conformity. Advancement depended on alignment with these norms. Those who adapted advanced more easily. Those who resisted remained constrained. Success carried responsibility. Those who achieved stability were often expected to support extended family and community. Remittances, childcare, and sponsorship reinforced obligation across generations. Advancement did not eliminate responsibility, it redistributed it. Economic mobility remained uneven. Structural barriers persisted. Discrimination influenced hiring, promotion, and access to capital. Geography shaped outcome. Policy mattered. Progress occurred, but it was fragile. Political engagement matured. Communities moved from reaction to strategy. Advocacy focused on incremental gains. Coalitions formed around shared interests. Participation expanded cautiously. Moments of crisis tested belonging. Economic downturns, labor disputes, and political shifts resurfaced suspicion. Communities were asked to demonstrate loyalty repeatedly. Acceptance contracted under stress and expanded during stability. Adaptation continued. Identity remained flexible rather than fixed. People learned to move between spaces, adjusting behavior and expression as context required. This adaptability became a form of strength. Home redefined itself again. It was no longer solely a place of residence or origin. It became a network of relationships, institutions, and shared experience. Belonging was enacted daily rather than declared. This complexity defined becoming American. It was not uniform, it was not complete, it was lived. Over generations, the meaning of belonging continued to evolve. What began as adaptation became inheritance. Children born into the new world did not experience arrival as rupture. They inherited its consequences without living its cause. Their relationship to identity was shaped by context rather than choice. This distance changed perspective. Sacrifice became story. Hardship became lesson. Memory shifted from survival to explanation. These narratives influenced values, ambition, and caution, even as lived experience diverged from the original conditions that produced them. Opportunity expanded unevenly. Some families experienced upward mobility. Education opened doors, employment diversified, geographic movement increased. These gains were real, but they were not universal. Inequality persisted within and between communities. Success did not erase vulnerability. Economic downturns, political shifts, and social unrest exposed lingering precarity. Progress proved reversible. Stability required maintenance rather than assumption. Belonging remained conditional. Periods of acceptance alternated with moments of suspicion. Loyalty was questioned during crisis. Identity was scrutinized. Communities learned that inclusion could contract as quickly as it expanded. Yet commitment deepened. Investment in place increased. Families built businesses, institutions, and networks that tied them to the future of the nation. Participation extended beyond necessity into influence. Civic presence grew. Representation expanded slowly. Advocacy achieved incremental change. Participation became expected rather than exceptional. Influence remained limited, but visibility increased. Identity stabilized without finality. Being American did not require uniformity. It required navigation. It involved balancing continuity with adaptation, memory with participation. This balance became generational. Each generation renegotiated its relationship to identity, opportunity, and belonging. The process did not conclude, it repeated. Part 5 closes not with resolution, but with continuity. Becoming American was not an outcome. It was an ongoing condition shaped by endurance, contribution, and change.